thought we'd begin with an article by Sam Harris that I think he wrote right after the attack. This was like October 12th. And the article is called The Sin of Moral Equivalence, so you can imagine where it's going. So the paragraph I'd like to read just says, of course, there's much to talk about when considering the ethics of war and violence. There's much more to be confused about. For instance, as this war proceeds, many people will consider the deaths of non-combatants on the Palestinian side to be morally equivalent to the kids who were tortured and murdered at the peace concert by Hamas, or the hostages who may yet be murdered and their murders broadcast on social media. But they're not. There's a difference between collateral damage, which is, of course, a euphemism for innocent people killed in a war, and the intentional massacre of civilians for the purpose of maximizing horror. Simply counting the number of dead bodies is not a way of judging the moral balance here. Intentions matter. It matters what kind of world people are attempting to build. If Israel wants to perpetuate a genocide of the Palestinians, it could do that easily tomorrow. But that isn't what it wants. And the truth is, the Jews of Israel would live in peace with their neighbors if their neighbors weren't enthralled to genocidal fanatics.
I actually am sympathetic to one thing that Sam Harris says there about the genocide claim, which is that, I don't have a strong view on whether Israel's committing genocide. It's just like that's a facet of the debate that I just haven't explored really at all.
Like, I don't think it's massively morally deal breaking one way or the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that too. Same thing when people talk about is Israel an apartheid state, etc. It's like, well, why not? Let's just talk about what's happening. Let's just like talk about the facts, and then let's talk about how we should like morally evaluate them, rather than like which buzzwords you can apply to what's going on. But anyways, yeah, I mean the like one kind of like prima facie argument that I'm sympathetic to in favor of Israel not committing genocide is just that like, it seems like overall Israel's killing a fairly small percentage of the population of Gaza. And it seems like if they wanted to, they could kill a much larger percentage of the population in Gaza. And so if their intention was to cause a genocide, it seems like that's really not what you'd expect. I mean, I think Sam Harris makes like, we can talk about the kind of ethics of this distinction he's drawing between intentionally killing civilians and then like how did he say collateral damage. I think he also just makes a kind of an empirical mistake in asserting that what Hamas does is intentionally target civilians and what Israel does is, target Hamas and then sometimes on accident kill people via collateral damage. Like we just have lots of documented cases. We have evidence for it in this particular case of the 2023, now 2024 Israel-Gaza war. And then we have just a wealth of evidence from previous conflicts of Israel directly, intentionally targeting civilians, destroying civilian infrastructure and killing civilians in cases where there were no Hamas fighters present and no plausible military objective, basically with the aim of, like I said earlier, creating domestic pressure from those populations on the militaries and combatants that they're targeting in the war, but also just like demonstrating their deterrence capacities and so on. So we know this is something that Israel does frequently, is intentionally kill civilians for tactical reasons. So I think, yeah, he's just operating off of an empirical mistake. And by the way, this is something that literally like the UN has acknowledged this. There have been UN reports showing that Israel does this, like most famously the Goldstone report. And obviously that's contentious given Goldstone's retraction, but we could debate about that. Amnesty International reports have borne out that Israel does this in various different conflicts. Human Rights Watch reports have borne out that Israel does this. B'Tselem reports have claimed that Israel does this. So this isn't really all that contentious or controversial from the perspective of the international human rights literature. Sam Harris just likes to claim that this isn't something Israel does with no evidence, even though that's a very kind of fringe perspective that isn't really borne out in any of the literature.
So the first thing I think is worth considering is that even granting Sam Harris's assumption about intentions, his view seems to be that intentions matter a huge amount, but I think that we should reasonably limit the amount to which intentions matter. You should be able to judge that one action is significantly morally worse if it kills like a magnitude more people, even if the intentions are better. So even if it's true that Israel is trying only to kill Hamas operatives, but ends up killing 20,000 Palestinian civilians, on the other hand, Hamas is actively trying to kill as many civilians as possible. It still seems that because of the very limited numbers of civilians killed, which is many hundreds, about 1,000, right? That the conclusion should be that at least they're pretty similar morally, if not the Israeli action is far worse morally. And I think that Sam Harris just seems to have this view overall that intentions matter far more than they seem to matter to me.
I agree with that. And while we're talking about the basically the morality of intentions when it comes to evaluating different actors in a conflict, I think one thing that's like often lost on people sometimes, or maybe even people like Sam Harris who make this comparison, is that I also think there's something quite bad morally about having these like goals or intentions where you want to pursue some aim. So like in this case, like kill Hamas, and you just don't care about like anything else like that stands in your way. It's like sort of collateral damage.
Yeah, it's like if somebody like blew up like an elementary school, we'd be like, dude, what the fuck? But then if he was like, oh no, don't worry, the principal like, killed my wife, so I was getting revenge, and I just didn't really care. I had to kill the rest of the children and the people in the building to get to that guy, and that's just fine with me. Like, maybe our moral evaluation would change a little bit, but like not that much. Like we wouldn't say there's like some massive qualitative gulf, I think.
Yeah, and I think what it's worth noting is that for that guy, I would definitely say that he's acted morally worse than somebody who, in cold blood, premeditatedly kills one person, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a good point too. And I think like Noam Chomsky tried to make this point to Sam Harris as well in their email exchange that like no, actually this distinction between viewing like, oh, my end is to kill people, like that's my end in and of itself, versus like, oh, my end is some other thing and killing people is just like collateral damage I'm fine with and am kind of indifferent to. This isn't that all that morally relevant a distinction.
Yeah, so maybe the only other thing is to say, I think that the induction that Sam Harris has here, which is that if Israel had more malicious incentives than just to kill Hamas, they would not be acting the way they do. I'm not sure that even if Israeli officials really badly wanted to commit genocide, they would think it's worthwhile given the situation with their allies. I'm not sure that given the current political state of the West would be continue to be highly supportive of Israel if they extremely obviously just commit genocide. So maybe what there is to say here is that, for example, Israeli diplomats and leaders have privately pushed for things like moving hundreds of thousands of Gazans to Egypt for the duration of the war. And I'm not sure, I find it a little bit difficult to believe that they would all be allowed back into Gaza afterwards. So it seems that at least if there are nefarious intentions like, I don't know, decreasing the Gazan population, making it easier to have more settlements in the future, something like that, their actions wouldn't be that unexpected under this hypothesis.
And Sam Harris likes to, in addition to his distinction between like, yeah, he has a few argumentative moves he really likes with respect to Israel Palestine, and one of them is this distinction between collateral damage and killing people being your intrinsic goal. But then like another one is he makes this point about like that he kind of gestures at in the quote that you gave, where he like, he's like, well, the Hamas, if the positions were reversed, right, and all of a sudden the Palestinians had the power over Israelis that Israelis have over Palestinians, then the Palestinians would be being way more brutal towards the Israelis than the Israelis are currently being towards the Palestinians. I don't think that that's all that interesting morally, especially because like, sure, you're saying like, what if positions were reversed right now, given the history that there's been for like the past several decades. But I think that kind of like removes some like very ethically relevant dimensions of the conflict from consideration. Like, so to give like a kind of an analogy, imagine if I like kidnapped somebody and my intention with them was bad, but it wasn't like as bad as it could be. Like, I don't want to kill them or torture them. I just want to kind of kidnap them and keep them like imprisoned in my basement with like minimal food and water and technology and so on. So they have like a really shitty life. And then like over time, they obviously are going to build up lots of resentment towards me. And it might get to the point where they have so much resentment over the fact that I've been kidnapping them that they like want to kill me. In fact, they want to kill me pretty brutally. So if we switch the positions and all of a sudden now I'm trapped in that person's basement, they're going to do a lot worse things to me than what I'm doing to them. But the point is, the reason that they have those dispositions and those kinds of attitudes such that that's the way that they would act if positions were reversed is because in the actual world, I'm the one that's been oppressing them and not vice versa. And I think that's like very, very morally relevant. And I don't think it's appropriate to kind of just remove that from our kind of ethical consideration of what's going on.
Yeah, and certainly, like it seems like in that case, basically, like what the person is doing in the actual world, this person who's kidnapped this person, seems like way more relevant, than like what these people would do in different possible worlds where the roles were reversed.
The entire argumentative move is strange because it would seem to imply that it's justified to just intern people if they have bad intentions towards you. Like if I walk down the street and I just somehow psychically know that somebody really intends to kill me, even if they're like physically unable to, that I would be justified in locking them up. And this seems wrong. And so then, people might point to the disanalogy being that, well, Palestinians and Hamas specifically are actually capable of doing this type of damage to Israel. But as we've talked about earlier, that just seems highly in doubt. I mean, the ability to do another fairly large attack seems very unlikely. So then the intention alone doesn't seem like that much of a reason to maintain an unjustified and unreasonable occupation.
I mean, so I guess it depends. The relevance of that point, I guess, to be fair, depends on what they are trying to prove by making the point, which is like, are you saying that, okay, because if the roles were reversed, the Palestinians would be doing worse stuff? Are you saying that because of that, the occupation should continue and that justifies the Israeli treatment of Palestinians? Because that's obviously just a terrible argument, in part for the reasons that you were just talking about. But they could also just be making a weaker point, which is like, okay, if we're ethically evaluating the conflict, this is grounds for claiming that there's like this sort of fundamental moral asymmetry between Palestinians and Israelis, and that the Palestinians are worse in the conflict of the context than the Israelis because of this difference in moral dispositions.
Even so, I still think the example could work. Like imagine that person who's just talking about actually like locks this person up and tortures him because he knows that like this person like wants to kill him, but obviously like the person is clearly incapable of doing it for whatever reason. They don't have the means, maybe, or something like that, or they're incredibly weak. So
Yeah,
this
it's like
person locks them up and tortures
worse.
them. Who's worse? Yeah, like it seems
Right.
like that person.
I take it that you're right that Sam Harris wasn't exactly making the point that I was referring to earlier. I do think, however, that there are people who I don't know why are taken seriously who do seem to say this type of thing as
That's
an
true,
excuse
yeah.
for why you shouldn't like negotiate with Hamas at all. But then it seems like the real reason, the only plausible reason that actually makes sense to me is if you think that the fact that they have these intentions and giving them a state would allow them to enact those types of intentions,
Mhm.
and they were to maintain those intentions after you give them a state. But the last two seem at least highly in doubt.
Yeah, and just to clarify, like, I agree with you that those assumptions are in doubt, and they're in doubt like um in part because intentions are just a very, very small part of the story. Obviously, you have to consider their practical constraints and so on. So, like, even if, when given a state, the Palestinians would still like to see the destruction of Israel, they'd still be highly unlikely to actually do it because obviously their military power will never even come close to Israel's. So, any offensive of that sort, if the Palestinians were given a state and then tried to attack Israel, it's obviously, like, without a doubt going to fail. And then they're just going to end up finding themselves in a worse position. They'll probably be reoccupied. Then Israel will have much more carte blanche than they do even currently to go all out on the Palestinians, because then they'll have this like, oh, well, we tried peace and we even gave them a two-state solution, but they just didn't accept it. So, just like given those practical constraints, and given that it would just be so obviously not in the Palestinian interest to pursue those ambitions, you wouldn't expect them to try to pursue it. The fact is, the political intentions of various populations and political organizations shift along with the political context. And the Israelis are in a position where they have the capability to change the political context in a way that engenders a substantial political shift.